on this Q&A live session on part 1 that we presented on Saturday morning on Malaysia's 4th 7/interim Prime Minister, who I described. Joseph Schumpeter is a very famous economist, and he used the term creative destruction to describe a productive feature of capitalism, that capitalism has to go through a process of creative destruction. Whatever you destroy, from there you create something better. So that's how capitalism reinvent itself and sustain itself. So our 4th 7th Prime Minister, I describe him as the opposite. Whatever he creates, he destroys. So that's why I call him a destructive creator. So that was Saturday. Now we're going through Q&A and answer some of the comments that we've received a lot of comments, a lot of them. And I'll try to maybe go through the contents, the themes that are raised. Instead of addressing each comment, I'll go through the themes and the contents that are raised by the comments, because I think it's impossible to answer every single comment, right? Now, I want to share with you the first important point that I'd like to make, right? So if you can see the slide, here is the thing. This is my personal quotation. All truths are easy to understand once you discover them, but you have to discover them first. And truths have to be based on facts, right? Facts, whether it's historical, present facts, whatever it is, it has to be facts. And then facts sometimes can be obtained from a single source, or sometimes facts have to be obtained from multiple sources where you get opposing views and you arrive at what is most likely the most balanced view of that particular circumstance, situation, the person or country or whatever it is. So what we want to do with this video, with this live session, is to share the truths, the facts with Malaysians, because as I mentioned on Saturday, many of us are not aware, many of us don't even know that such facts exist. And before I proceed, I have to say something very clearly, that no one sponsored us, no one financed our live session, no one except Teng Boo himself. I don't need anyone to kind of sponsor me. I don't need anyone to kind of finance this, because all I want to do is to present the truth. If you agree with it, great. If you don't agree with it, fine. Malaysia doesn't belong to me alone. Malaysia belongs to all Malaysians. If you don't think that truths are important to you, don't bother to find the truth. Don't bother with the facts. Then when the country rots, when the country deteriorates, don't blame anyone. Right? So this is a very open discussion. You can agree, you can disagree, but look, when the facts are presented, when they are seen from multiple angles to be reliable, open your mind. Look at the facts. You may not agree with them. Like I said, truths can be very painful. But what if those facts are truth? What if what you perceive is wrong? Right? I could be wrong. But to prove me wrong, give me facts. Don't give me all kinds of grand notions, grand ideas. First thing, one comment from NG. The 4th Prime Minister had to implement the new economic policy unlike the 3 Prime Ministers before. That is wrong. The NEP was launched and implemented during the 2nd Prime Minister. Hussein Onn had to implement the new economic policy. So the new economic policy was really implemented for about 10 to 11 years before he became Prime Minister. And don't forget, the 4th Prime Minister was Malaysia's Deputy Prime Minister. Deputy Prime Minister from 1976 onwards, at which time Tun Hussein Onn was the Prime Minister. But all of you would know, if you go and do your research, Tun Hussein Onn was already not in good health, and he was a lawyer by training. So this fourth Prime Minister, who before that he was the Education Minister, he had already plenty of time to implement the NEP. And in fact, if you look at the time when he was Education Minister, go and do the research. I don't have to do, because I'm talking about his economic track record. I'm not talking about his track record as a politician. Go and do your research on what he did as the Education Minister of Malaysia starting from 1974. So first fact is NEP was implemented during Razak's time, not during 1981-82. That is very important. Okay, second question. Which Pakatan will win the Kedah election? I don't know. That's not the topic of the day. And who knows? Malaysian voters, one day they vote this, one day they vote that. Like any democracies in the world, it's the same thing, right? So I don't know the results. And why, from Tan Weng Chong, why talk about this old man? It's important. Like one of you commented, because a lot of young Malaysians still adore him, still believe him, still think that he's Malaysia's savior. So the facts have to be known. These young Malaysians will determine the future of Malaysia, will determine the future of Malaysia for old guys like me. I want to live in a happy Malaysia, in a harmonious Malaysia. I have the right as well. I'm a Malaysian also. And I think the others have said that what role did Dine play? I don't want to talk about that because that's a different topic. Petronas Twin Tower is a good project built by a Korean and Japanese contractor. Listen to my part 2 when it comes to the Petronas Twin Tower and the Dayabumi. Not so much the Twin Tower, but Dayabumi. Listen to my part 2. Part 2, I think we're going to play it on this coming Wednesday. It's equally shocking for those of you who hero worship him, shocking for those of you who think that he's really destroyed Malaysia, because I will present you facts that probably most of you are not aware or have not taken the trouble to dig deeper. All right. And some of the comments are like cronies are here to stay, they don't disappear. Totally agree, because many of the cronies are still around. You have to ask yourself, talking about economic performance, why is it that during Hussein Onn, during Tunku Abdul Rahman and Razak's time, why is it that there are no cronies? Why is it that under the first 3 prime ministers, there's no such thing as money politics? Why is it that the cronism and the money politics only came when we started to have Look East policy? Japan is famous for money politics. It's the mother of money politics. Japan is famous for crony capitalism. So is it a coincidence that after the 4th prime minister came in, money politics and crony capitalism became Malaysia's way of life? Don't take my word for it. Do your own research. Find those that support my view. Find those that don't support my view. And then dig deeper. So let me just quickly go through some of the other things that I couldn't point out because I don't want to make the session too long. Let's go to the next. This disaster during the 4th prime minister's time. This is a photo of who could have been Malaysia's hero, but someone where most Malaysians are not aware of. His name is Jalil Ibrahim. He was the internal auditor of Bank Bumiputra in the 80s. He was murdered in a mysterious way in Hong Kong in July 1983. Until now, that's about 40 years later, there's still no satisfactory closure as to why he was murdered. Now, this is because BMF, Bumiputra Malaysia Finance, was a subsidiary of Bank Bumiputra, right? And to cut a long story short, you can read the text that I put it out for you, right? And there was a lot of scandal regarding BMF and Bank Bhumiputra. So because there are a lot of close connections with BMF and Bank Bhumiputra with many Malaysian politicians. So now we don't know the truth. All we know is that this poor, very good internal auditor was murdered. Next, can we share the next? Maminko tin scandal under the fourth Prime Minister. Also something that most Malaysians have forgotten or not aware of. Well, when he was Prime Minister, the tin price was falling. You could say that his intentions were good. He wanted to support the tin price. But good intentions are not good enough to manage the country. His method was totally stupid. The fourth Prime Minister went to artificially support tin price using EPF money. Of course, look, tin price is determined by global demand and supply, right? Malaysia, okay, at that time, you're the largest producer of tin. You think you can go and control the tin price? Okay, so you use precious EPF money to support the tin price. Within a short time, tin price collapsed. And then Malaysia EPF and Malaysia as a whole lost a lot of money. And nobody knows the truth until now, the real truth. Next. So the next one is in the early 90s, I think it was 1991, where Bank Negara was asked to speculate in the foreign exchange market. Bank Negara lost billions and billions. What? Why on earth is the Central Bank of Malaysia speculating in the foreign exchange market? What are you trying to do? In 1998, you say, I must have capital control. In 1991, you go and speculate in the forex market. What kind of economic management is that? And up to now, we still don't know the truth. Again, unfortunately. So these are three very famous scandals that I want to add on to his economic performance, so-called lousy economic performance, right? And like I mentioned earlier, right, I think somebody or one or two of you commented that, put in a very suspicious question. Who sponsored me? Who financed me? Like I said, don't worry. Nobody financed me. Nobody sponsored me. I used my own hard-earned money to do all this, right? For the good of Malaysians. If you want to know the truth, you listen. If you're not interested, fair enough. It's your ears, it's your country. Let me share with you what I wrote in 1994. That is how many years ago? That's 29 years ago, 28 years ago. We wrote in our weekly publication called iCapital. 3rd November 1994. The average wage increase for January to July 1994 was 6.7% versus a productivity increase of only 2.2%. Place this in our context of 8 years of rapid growth. At this rate of productivity growth, Malaysia would be an uncompetitive nation very fast. Our rapid economic growth would instead lead to disastrous consequences. Hello? This is 1994. Right in the middle of rapid growth. There is no doubt that productivity must rise for economic growth to be sustained. The only problem is that this is the difficult part of industrialization. Okay, let me just switch on my aircon. It's a bit hot. Now you may say that, okay, what's the big deal? You wrote one thing in 1994 and you scream. Let's look at another one. In 1995 April, Malaysia has succeeded and achieved much economic success over the last 8 to 9 years. It has transformed and it is still transforming. Many would be surprised to hear us say that the easy part of this economic transformation in the last 8-9 years is over. 1995 April. This is not to deny the significant achievements made in the last 8-9 years. It is just that the more difficult stage of the economic transformation and development of Malaysia is now actually staring at us in 1995. We have reached the stage where national human resource development, utilization, and availability is the key to achieve Vision 2020. Don't forget, we're short of workers at that time. We started importing foreign workers, a lot of them, during those years. Okay, you may say, big deal. 2 articles. Next. 1995, April. The challenging part is to manage the people in a situation where there's almost full employment, to utilize the facilities productively and efficiently. In the longer term, improvements in total factor productivity will replace capital accumulations as the main source of economic growth. As you can see, I'm using economic terms because I'm trained in economics. And I'm looking at it from an economic standpoint, not from a political standpoint. So, in 1995, Capital Dynamics was a very small firm, it was a very small fund. But even if a small fund like Capital Dynamics could see the warning signs, why is it that our Prime Minister, who was so full of himself, couldn't see the warning signs? This was 2 to 3 years before the Asian crisis. Okay, let's look at another article that we wrote this time in June 1996. At Capital Dynamics, our very long-standing and consistent stance on Malaysia's economic development is simple. Our rapid growth is sustainable and can be sustained. There's one proviso though: tackling, sustaining, and improving our productivity. iCapital has been voicing its concern over such important matters. We have repeatedly said that we need to urgently and intensively tackle the issue of productivity nationwide, or else Malaysia will be running out of time and soon out of economic breath. We must, for example, ask simple but tough questions like, should we let the uneconomical and inefficient sectors decline at a faster rate so that precious resources are released? Is productivity understood by all? Is it accepted by all Malaysians that it is the only source and the only way for us to maintain our growth and our increasingly luxurious way of life? Is total factor productivity clearly understood? For example, can the by now famous and sometimes unexplainable traffic jams in Kuala Lumpur be solved or alleviated by improving total factor productivity instead of just throwing more money on highways, flyovers, etc., and collecting more toll charges? Why? Construction is one of the most important sources of corruption in Malaysia. The more flyovers, the more blah, blah, blah you build, the better it is. But total factor productivity, if you listen to my other YouTube recording where I explain what TFP is all about, TFP doesn't allow you for this kind of funny leakages. But in 1996, we really warned of economic disasters. We really warned of Malaysia running out of economic breath. So I'm not talking about his lousy economic performance now in 2023. I said this 25, 26, 27 years ago. But of course, Capital Dynamics, who are we? We are small fat. Who wants to listen to us? Right? I mean, you got so many better advisors, better analysts than us, right? Let's look at one other economic achievements of his. All of you will know KL International Airport, right? Like I said, these are truth, these are facts. How many of you know that the distance from the city center to the international airport for KLIA is the furthest in the entire world. In the entire world. If you compare KLIA to city center, it's about 80 odd kilometers. Shanghai is to Pudong is about 50. Hong Kong is about 40. This is the new Hong Kong airport that was built in 1998. If you compare with Sydney, Sydney is only 15 kilometers. Bangkok, Dong Mun is only 24 kilometers. If you compare with international cities like London with Heathrow, Heathrow is only about 26 kilometers. JFK Airport in New York is about 20 plus kilometers. So why on earth do we have to build an airport? By the way, Subang to KL City Center is only 24 kilometers, right? So why on earth do we have to build an airport that is the furthest in the world? And we don't even now you can ask any Malaysian, why did we have to build KLIA in Sepang? Let me do a simple arithmetic for you. Right? I'm using the figures now. You take a Grab to KLIA now, it's about 65 ringgit. You take Grab to Subang is 28 ringgit. So the difference is about 37 ringgit. In 2019, before the pandemic, there were 62 million passenger movements in KLIA. 62 million. So for every trip you make to KLIA, you have to pay extra 37 ringgit extra. Multiply by that, right? This is only one way, not two ways. Multiply by that. The passengers that use KLIA have to pay out of their own pocket money 2.3 billion ringgit. 1 year. KLIA has been around for 25 years. And this is only one way. You multiply by that, by 2, you got 4 billion ringgit wasted for nothing. And up to now, we still don't even know why do we have to build the airport that is the furthest from the city center, the furthest in the world. Right? I'm just counting the difference between, I'm just using a very simple illustration. You can criticize my example and so on and so forth, but I just want to put a point across, right? And if you can get the point, that's good enough. I'm happy. So the thing is, we are not counting the time wasted. I'm only counting the financial cost. What about the time, the extra time? And guess who operate the KL Express from KL City Center to KLA? Who's the one operating that? So that's another one of your white elephant. I've spoken in other recordings where we said that KLA is so badly maintained that it's so run down. The aero train is the most famous aero train in the world for breaking down. So often that it has to be closed down for 2 years. And you may think that KLA was the big deal, it's just another airport. Of all the infrastructure that Malaysia has, right, KLIA is the most important infrastructure from an international image point of view. That is the infrastructure that all foreigners, I wouldn't say all, most foreigners would have to go through. So, for those of you to address some of your comments, you say that why compare with Singapore? Singapore is a tiny island, tiny red dot. Okay, you can say that. On the other hand, Singapore could say that, if you were to manage my tiny red dot, you probably make it submerged. Because my tiny red dot has got no water supply, I got to rely on Johor for water supply, I got no sand, I got to get sand from Indonesia, I got no eggs, I got to get eggs from whichever neighboring countries, I got no food security, I got no food supply, and yet I can manage to succeed. So the counter arguments, you may say that Malaysia shouldn't compare with Singapore, right? Okay, because otherwise people accuse that, wow, this Malaysian Chinese, pro-Singapore, pro-PAP. Let's forget about that. Let's just look at facts. This is a diagram that I presented on Saturday. Let's look at Thailand, Taiwan, South Korea. So some of you say, why don't we compare with the successful African countries? Now, that's great. We should do that maybe. But I took these countries for a very simple reason. When you want to do economic comparison, you got to be honest with yourself whether your comparison is justified or not. You can compare with a lot of other things. You can compare with Latin America, Argentina, right? You can compare with Europe, and so on and so forth. I compare these countries because around the 80s, these four countries had more or less the same level of economic development and more or less the same level of GDP as Malaysia. We're starting more or less on the same footing. So we're going to compare apple with apple. I may not exactly give you an apple with apple comparison. I will give you an apple with a jumbo apple. At least it's close enough, correct? Now, you look at this. Some of you say, oh, there's one, I cannot remember who's commented, oh, his capital control, thanks to the fourth prime minister, he saved Malaysia during the 97, 98 crisis. His capital control saved Malaysia. Look, I just want to repeat the facts. When did the 97 crisis break out? July 97, correct? When did the capital control was it imposed? September 1998, right? 14 months later, correct? By which time the ringgit had already plunged to 380. By which time the ringgit was so undervalued that it was about to stop falling. By which time the Asian crisis was almost over. So why after 14 months you impose capital control when the Asian crisis is almost over, when the ringgit has already plunged from 240, 250 to 380? These three countries that I showed you, or three territories, South Korea had no capital control, Thailand had no capital control, right? All of them recovered better than Malaysia. I mean, this was from 82 to 2003. I presented on Saturday another chart that shows you from 1998 to 2003. You can refer to that. Now, go back. So this one is to show you that these four territories and countries started from more or less the same level. And in that 23 years, 22 years, we fell behind. I mean, what is that to argue with this fact? I don't understand. I'm not comparing Malaysia with Japan. I'm not comparing Malaysia with Switzerland. I'm not comparing Malaysia with Singapore. I'm comparing Malaysia with other economies that started at more or less the same level. So what do you want me to do? Compare Malaysia with Zimbabwe? Of course lah. You want to compare Malaysia with Somalia, Zimbabwe? Of course. Because most other countries will do better, isn't it? Not just Malaysia, right? So the other fact which all of you have forgotten is what we showed is the current account deficit. There are those who say that fourth prime minister saved Malaysia during the 97 crisis. Look at the facts. Look at the current account deficit. I already explained in my other recording why the ringgit kept falling, because of one of the reasons, not the only one, because of our persistent current account deficit. From the time that he entered office in 1981 to the time the Asian crisis broke out in 1997. In 1995, our current account deficit was almost 10%. Any developing economy with a 10% current account deficit is going to get whacked, not just Malaysia. And you know that I mentioned earlier in 94, 95, 96, we had already written about total factor productivity. Why? Because the only way for Malaysia to keep growing at a high rate without incurring current account deficit is to have high total factor productivity, high productivity. Once you have that, then you do not have to import so much. Then your current account deficit will drop. Or you can import the same amount, but because you're productive in using those, then your revenue generated, your output generated, whether in the form of exports or local sales, would be high, and therefore can cover, and your current account deficit would be reduced. But you talk to him in 95, 96, you talk to him about factor TFP productivity, I'll be chased out. I'll be saying that I'll be talking nonsense. Doesn't matter, because 10 years, 20, 30 years later, all the results prove that we were right. that we ignore productivity at our cost, at the price to the entire country. That is why I keep saying that this fourth Prime Minister pygmified. You know what's pygmified, right? Pygmified means you become so tiny. Pygmify the Malaysian economy. The capital control pygmify us. And another person now pointed out, I think one of the more recent comments, that he says that it is not correct for us to describe the 85, 86 recession as something similar to the US Great Depression. Let me give you the facts. Most of you, 85, that'll be about how many years ago? 40 odd years ago, right? Many of you either not born, or maybe you're too young, or too small, or you don't know what it is like at that point in time. You look at this chart that I have in front of you, 85, 86. Now, the depression that Malaysia faced in 85, 86 had to be measured in nominal terms, not in real terms, because what happened was our terms of trade, our export revenue all plunged, and therefore it affected the economy at a nominal level. Okay, like I said, I'm trained as an economics major. I don't want to go into technical details, but the nominal GDP shows you how severe it was. In 85, nominal GDP shrank 3%, about there. In 1986, it was about 8%. So you cannot add the two and say we shrank 13%. That's wrong. Because in 84, Malaysia's nominal GDP expanded at about 13%. So the swing is from plus 13% to minus 8%. And what is a recession? A recession technically is 2 quarters of contraction, 2 or 3 quarters. A depression is when you have contraction of 2 consecutive years. That is generally accepted. So why is it that I equate Malaysia's 85, 86 crisis as a depression? You know, in the 1929 US Great Depression, do you know that the New York stock market was never closed? Despite very severe crash, constant crashes, it was never closed. Do you know that in 1985, KLSE, Bursa Malaysia, which was linked to Singapore Stock Exchange at that time, do you know that the two stock exchanges, because the crisis was so severe, had to be shut down for 3 days? And you tell me that that is not equivalent to the US Great Depression? The US Great Depression had 3 bank holidays because they had banking crisis. So the banking industry was closed for 3 days. We had our stock market closed for 3 days. And like I mentioned in the previous and another recording, you look at public bank now, wow, so big and strong. Public bank, we had a banking crisis, but it wasn't closed. But you have panic withdrawals from major banks like public bank all over the country. And for those of you who have forgotten, because if you do internet searches, Google searches on Malaysia's economic depression, contraction in 1985, 1986, you get very little results because nothing is safe on the internet. Very few. But let me just tell you a fact that all the koperasi, all the cooperatives, which are the Chinese koperasi, almost all of them went bankrupt. The entire Chinese community, where they save a lot of their money in koperasi, all of them lost their money. And it took them, I cannot remember exactly how long, it took them a very long time for the depositors of the koperasi to be able to get back whatever little that is left of the koperasi. Another fact, why 85-86 was like the US Great Depression. A true story, because at that time tin price collapsed, rubber price collapsed, palm oil price collapsed, oil price collapsed, sawn timber price all collapsed. Even though the global economy was expanding, Japan was booming, US was booming. In 86, after all this collapsed, This guy walked into, this is a true story, walked into a house about 7 o'clock at night where the family was having dinner. He walked inside the house, he told the family, said, look, you can call the police, you can report to the police if you want to, but I'm going to go straight into your kitchen. I just want to get some food for my family. If that is not a depression, I do not know what a depression is. And an engineer with 7-8 years experience cannot get a job even though the asking salary was only 300 ringgit. Our employment rate, that time was not so accurate, was nearly double digit. So that is just to comment on the comment that our depression is not as severe as the Great Depression of US. Our entire stockbroking industry collapsed. It was, of course, that pulled down the banking industry. Our property sector collapsed. Many of you may not have heard of Tan Sri Chong Kok Lim. Many of you have not heard of Tan Sri Wong Kee Tat because they all disappeared, because they all got crashed. They all went bankrupt in the 85-86 depression. Chong Kok Lim is a tin miner who built Sungai Wang Plaza. Yeah, he's the one. And in the 85-86 depression, he went bankrupt. Wong Kee Tat, famous, he's the one who built Kia Plaza. Kia Plaza is next to Star Hill, what is known as Fahrenheit. That was known as Kia Plaza at that time. And it was owned by Wong Kee Tat. In that 1 or 2 years, he went bankrupt because of this crash that happened to the property market, to the banking sector, to the stockbroking sector, to literally everything in the Malaysian economy. Maybe the only sector that wasn't affected was growing paddy. And I'll show you later what happened to our ringgit against many currencies in the mid-80s, which is next. Right? Many of you said, oh, ringgit falling now, cost of living so high. This is ringgit versus AUD. If you look at the red circle, I have a red circle for you in the diagram, a red line. That is 1985. You can see the ringgit depreciated against AUD, up, down. But by the 90s, ringgit was already far below the Aussie dollar. It's not just against the Aussie dollar. Look at another currency against the USD, right? You see the red circle? That is 85, 86 during the Great Depression of Malaysia. Okay, that was our own crash. If you hear the crashing sound, something crashed in our studio. I apologize for that. Okay, that time was about, let me see, about 2 ringgit 30, 2 ringgit 220, 230 to US dollar. And you can see the chart, right? By the late 80s, by the early 90s, our ringgit had really fallen against the US dollar. Next. This is against Sing dollar. It's even worse. Again, the red circle is 85, 86. Right? We were about 1.1 ringgit to 1 Sing dollar. Right? By the by mid-90s, we were about 2 point something to the Sing dollar. So this is the economic performance of our fourth Prime Minister. What's the big deal? Your currency depreciated like mad, and nobody even complained. How can? You cannot ignore facts. Facts are facts. I didn't invent this. These are invented by the Forex market. Okay, some comments. Right. From Mr. Low Stretching, Mr. Tan, with the multiple whammy, political uncertainty, depreciation of the ringgit, current account deficit, stagnant wages, and inflationary pressures, how should a young Malaysian thrive in Malaysia? Why not? I started my business in 88, 89, at the time when the economy was just recovering. Right? First thing is, let me correct one fact. Malaysia now is not having current account deficit. Malaysia now is having budget deficit, but current account surplus. So we are not as vulnerable as in the 90s where we had budget deficit and current account deficit. Now we only have budget deficit, which is not that it should be tackled. It shouldn't be left alone, but we have current account surplus. Thanks to major policy success like the semicon industry, for example, which I'll talk about in part 2. Don't miss my part 2. Ringgit depreciation, I mentioned in our other recording, the short term and longer term. Shorter term is because of US interest rate, the way they've conducted their monetary policy, which was very late, very badly mismanaged. So that should be peaking. We'll see. The US inflation figure is going to come out this week. Let's see what the figure looks like. If it's coming down, like what is expected, then maybe the ringgit should be pausing, should be stabilizing. But should the US inflation rate still be higher than expected, then you can expect the US dollar to strengthen further. So to come back to your question, the young Malaysian thrive in Malaysia, of course you can. Through hard work, believing in yourself, have confidence in the country that we are able to choose and select better leaders. We make the mistake, we learn from our mistakes. Don't just listen to political slogans, political propaganda. Check the facts for yourself. Get to the truth for yourself. And then be creative. Right? I started my business in 88 at a time when it was very cheap. A lot of surplus in office space, cheap rental, a lot of workers, very good attitude, very hardworking, very realistic wages. So I think if you are prepared to put in the hard work and then don't lose hope in yourself, don't lose hope in the country, you can still make it. Malaysia is still a country, it's still a very blessed country. It's just that our politicians, whether left or right, whether ruling government, opposition, and all that, our politicians are hopeless, generally speaking. So if we are able to pick better political leaders from whichever front, Malaysia's future is damn bright. Like I shared in another recording, why I've not moved away from Malaysia, why I'm still having only Malaysia's passport. Teo Gap Singh, what do you see Prime Minister Anwar be able to do differently? Okay, this is a different topic together. We'll talk about that separately. This is about the fourth Prime Minister because I'm worried. He still thinks that he can save the country by the same method that he used to destroy the country. That's what worries me. And a lot of young Malaysians are so naive to think that he's the savior of Malaysia. So this is about destroying certain fiction, making sure that the myth are not easily believed by Malaysians. So that whether who will win and so on, whether the current Prime Minister will be a good Prime Minister, that's a different topic. Tan Koi Lai says, during the early 80s, we were head of Thailand, Taiwan, Korea. I used to go to these countries to teach them about economic development. Yeah. I mean, in the 80s, Thailand was ahead of us because what happened was part of the reason why Malaysia had a lot of FDI in the late 80s was because of the 1985 Plaza Accord. What happened in the Plaza Accord was the US government pressurized the Japanese government to appreciate the yen, right? Because the US dollar was appreciating until 85, and US dollar says, no, your Toyota is killing my auto industry, all your chip companies. And once upon a time, Japan was the leader in semiconductor, was dominating the semiconductor industry. So US government says, look, I mean, typical US, they always can never compete on fair ground. Told the Japanese government, I want you to appreciate your yen because you are succeeding, and when you shouldn't, you are a Japanese country. So Japan forced to appreciate the yen like mad. What happened? The Japanese SMEs and their multinationals, of course, had to relocate, had to move out. The first country they moved out to was Thailand, because Thailand was very proactive, very attractive to them. Then when they found that Thailand, after a few years, oh, maybe not so attractive anymore. When Malaysia competed, because Malaysia was desperate. Remember, we were in a depression. Our currency had to plunge like mad. We had to relax our NEP. I remember in another recording I told you, where the Industrial Coordination Act, which was introduced to implement NEP, we had to relax Industrial Coordination Act. So Malaysia became sort of the alternative to Thailand, right? In the 80s and all that. Now, Korea, yeah, you could argue that Korea and Malaysia maybe in the 80s were quite even. That if we have done correctly, we'll probably be at the same level as South Korea by now. But you see, South Korea had better government. They gave licenses to the Hyundai, to the Samsung, and all those things. All kinds of favorite treatment, which a lot of governments do. But they're smarter. They'll tell the Hyundai and the Samsung, I'll give you this license, for example, telco license, right? But for every dollar you earn domestically, you have to export $1 or $2. So there was a condition that the Korean chaebols must be globally competitive and successful. Our fourth prime minister, like an idiot, because he looked east, he looked into Japan. He gave all the licenses to benefit these people at the expense of the economy. And these people who got all these licenses don't have to export, don't have to compete globally. So that's why Korea, you see the Hyundai and Samsung all became global competitors. Whereas our telcos, our independent power producer, all jago kampong at the expense of Malaysian. Okay, Tan Mok Kui, current account surplus after 1997. Of course. Can we look at the current account chart again? It's very simple. Okay, we had current account deficit before that because we were importing a lot of equipment, and we were not using the equipment to generate export revenue. What are the, for example, the example that I gave in the past, we bought a lot. MAS expanded so rapidly. I think it doubled. MAS doubled its fleet size in 5 years, but it was not able to generate the revenue of the equivalent amount. So how are you going to pay for those expensive aeroplanes? That's for one example, right? And then when you build the Twin Towers, all of them are imported. Architect also imported, got to pay them. The person who designed the park in KLCC was a Brazilian landscape architect. We have to pay him something, if I remember correctly, something like $50 million at that point in time. So you build this Twin Tower, there were a lot of leakages coming out from the Malaysian economy, which contributed to current account deficit. And you have a lot of other white elephant, your Perwaja steel. All those needs a lot of imported equipment, but where is the revenue to pay back all this imported equipment? So when the crisis hit, right, all these white elephants, all mati. You don't have to import anymore. You don't have to import all those useless equipment, but you're still able to export, right? Your rubber, by that time, your semiconductor, your air condition, you're able to export. Of course, you have current account surplus. And that current account surplus up to now has been able to sustain. That's because our FDI has been on the low side. So that's very important. We must attract FDI without creating current account deficit. How to do that? Total factor productivity. Whatever you import, whatever equipment you import, you import 1 billion of equipment or whatever it is, you must, from that equipment, you must be able to manage it well and generate revenue of 2 billion, 3 billion, so that you have a current account surplus or trade surplus. Compare performance of PM post Mahathir Badawi. Actually, a lot of Malaysians don't realize, unfortunately, that when Badawi was Prime Minister, he implemented a lot of very good economic policies. But, the complaint at that time, my friends were telling me, Teng Boo, how can Badawi be Prime Minister? He sleeps in the office, he sleeps in the meeting, the Malaysian economy doesn't have the excitement and those kind of things. I said, look, of course, because he cut down on all those white elephants. There's no nonsensical infrastructure projects which will lead to current account deficit. Right? So he did the right thing. He introduced policies like maintenance. You must learn how to maintain instead of just don't maintain, buy new one again. Which country will survive? Badawi economic policies were very forward-looking. But among all the prime ministers, the one that I'll put as the best prime minister is Tunku Abdul Rahman, the first prime minister of Malaysia. Why? Because he was so far-sighted that even this arrogant fourth prime minister could not understand how far-sighted Tunku's policies were. Mahathir's policy was lopsided. He was focused on heavy industrialization, very unbalanced. Tunku Abdul Rahman, to his credit, took a balanced approach. Developed industries, developed services, developed agricultural resources, all at the same time. This is called a balanced economic growth. And you will not get current account deficit. Or even if you do, very manageable. Many Malaysians don't realize that Bank Bumiputra, which was set out to help the Malays, was set up under Tunku Abdul Rahman's time. Rizda, Mara College. Mara was previously not a university and so on, but it was upgraded during Tunku's time. Mahdi, also to service the Malay community, was set up Tunku's time. Most importantly, he allocated a lot of resources to Malaysia's agricultural sector. How many of you have heard of MADA? Muda Agricultural Development Authority. It was completed during Tunku's time. What happened? It's in Kedah, because at that time, Kedah, the rice was only harvested once a year. So with the completion of the Muda Dam and the Perdu Dam, the rice farmers in Kedah were able to do double cropping. Double cropping means that you double your income. So Tunku Abdul Rahman developed a balanced approach. And that will make sure that your economy doesn't get lopsided and doesn't become vulnerable, like what happened in 1997 or 1985. So if you want to ask me to rank of all the prime ministers, Tunku Abdul Rahman would be my number one. But unfortunately, who ousted him? Right, there are two very famous academicians, Richard Mill and another person. They wrote a book and they researched into it, that the person who orchestrated the ouster of Tunku Abdul Rahman was none other than the fourth prime minister. So you have this fourth prime minister who has this habit of kicking everybody out except himself, kicking the best prime minister that Malaysia has ever had, and putting the blame that the Tunku Abdul Rahman was not fair, not treating the Malays well. Why is Tunku so fair? Because the Malays, fourth prime minister complained that he's not treating the Malays well. The Chinese side was complaining that he's not treating the Chinese well. Indians were complaining that he's not treating the Indians well. When you have a leader that's criticized by all segments, then you have a leader who is taking care of national interests. And that is Tunku Abdul Rahman. And by the way, for those of you who are not old enough, during that time, the Malaysian society was so liberal. I remember the society, the time Tunku Abdul Rahman, he drinks whiskey, he plays poker, right? And he's Muslim. And The whole country accepted it. At that time, we have Rose Chan, the famous stripper who can perform her striptease act throughout Malaysia. And then you can go to Penang and buy a Playboy magazine. Imagine, man, buying a Playboy magazine. That was Malaysian society. So we had damn visionary, damn far-sighted economic policy, very good social policies, right? Very visionary. And who kicked him out? The fourth Prime Minister. Like I said, don't take my word for it. Do your own research. If you want, the two academicians who wrote the book and said that the fourth Prime Minister orchestrated the resignation of Tunku Abdul Rahman, I can give you the title, I can give you the authors. Okay, we have a lot of comments. SY Ng says, 85-86, I graduated, unable to find a job. Thank you, Mr. Ng or Mr. Ng, right? Because you're one actually who experienced what I was sharing with you, because you graduated in 85-86 and you were not able to find a job, had to venture out and got a job in Papua New Guinea. Wow, that was super adventurous. And I guess it must have been super desperate on your side, right? He says, SY Ng said that it was one of the most depressing time, unable to contribute to the economy. So here you go. Thank you for an eyewitness, because I experienced 85-86. I know how bad it is. Well, I guess Steve Leong, he says that he was very young at that time in 85-86. His parents lost money in the cooperative that I mentioned about, and the parents did not recover any of the money that they lost. If you have 1,000 over cooperative, you're talking about billions of dollars wiped out. And you're not saying that it's as bad as the US Great Depression. Oh boy. Well, it's really almost 9 o'clock. As usual, my session is always super long. I apologize because there's so many things to share. There's so many things to explain. And I do it with all my heart. I do it with all sincerity. As I said, all truths are easy to understand once you discover them, but you have to discover them first. You can agree with my facts, you can disagree, doesn't matter. You can say that whatever it is, but be open-minded. If I present evidence that's contrary to what you believe, to what other people have told you, take a step further, do more research, find out what is true, whether I said things wrongly or whether the other person said things wrongly. Then we will have a better Malaysia. A better Malaysia cannot just come out from choosing this leader, that leader. A better Malaysia can only come from our conviction, our hard work, our commitment to making this country better. So, well, thank you very much. And I hope you will listen to my part 2, because I can promise you there are a lot of facts that you will be very surprised to hear. So with that, good night and pleasant dreams.